Welcome to Holywood, one of the loveliest towns in Northern Ireland. Situated between the cities of Belfast and Bangor on the shores of the mighty Belfast Lough, Holywood has for at least 2 centuries served as a popular retreat from the Northern Irish capital, once as a destination for sea bathing, and today for shopping and a variety of riveting historical landmarks. On this walk, we'll make our way through the heart of Holywood on this gorgeous summer's day, but we begin here at the end of the town's high street, looking up at the remains of the centuries-old Holywood Priory. Established nearly 1400 years ago in the early 7th century, the Priory was the first settlement of note in the Holywood area, although the tower that we're looking at here is much newer, built in 1809 when this former monastery was converted for use as Holywood's parish church. However, the early 19th century tower was built on top of the much older Priory church here, the ruins of which date from the 12th century. The Priory church was once the focal building in what would have been a larger monastic complex in the medieval era, having originally been founded by the Saint Lazarin around the year 640 AD, although nothing of that original 7th century monastery remains today. Where the old monastery once existed, there now stands the ruined church beside us here, and Holywood's Churchyard cemetery, formerly the main site for burials in the town before it reached capacity, prompting the opening of the new town cemetery just across the road from here. Buried in this cemetery are many of the most famous figures in Holywood's history, who we'll talk more about as we make our way through the town, but the old Priory church here tells a riveting story of its own. In the 12th century, over 400 years after the original priory was established here by St. Lazarin, this area was visited by the Normans. Under the direction of John de Courcy, a man who held great power in this part of Ulster upon the Normans' arrival in the region, this medieval church was built as part of a new Augustinian priory, situated just between the waters of the Belfast Lough and lush forests further inland. Noticing the position of the priory on the edge of the forests, the Normans christened this place Sanctus Boscus, which from Latin translates as Holy Wood, which is where Holywood gets its name from. Later on in life, the priory was dissolved on the orders of King Henry VIII in 1541, after which the Priory church became Holywood's parish church, shared by Anglican and Presbyterian worshippers. But just across the cemetery from us here, we can see a separate church, the first Holywood Presbyterian church, which was established in 1615, and which came into important use after Presbyterian worshippers were effectively kicked out from the parish church here, for nonconformity with the Anglican Church of Ireland. After that point, Presbyterians worshipped just across the road from here, while this remained Holywood's Church of Ireland parish church from 1660 until 1844, when dramatic population growth in the town prompted the local congregation to eventually move away from here to the much larger and more modern Victorian building on Church Road a few streets away. Today, Holywood's ruined old priory is one of the most significant landmarks to be found in the modern town, as not only the oldest building in Holywood, but a striking portrayal of the medieval monastery which gave birth to the town that we know today. Now just outside the priory here, meanwhile, there stands a monument dedicated to 2 local young men, who sadly drowned while rowing out in Belfast Lough back in 1873. It's quite a large monument, but that only speaks to the impact that the death of those 2 young men would have had on the local community, which is certainly one of the more tightly knit in the region. But as we now make our way away from the site of the riveting old priory complex, let's break out a map to get a better idea of exactly where you'd find Holywood in Northern Ireland today. As we mentioned at the start of our walk, Holywood is situated in between the cities of Belfast and Bangor on the southern shore of Belfast Lough, in one of the more densely populated parts of Northern Ireland. Today, the town of Holywood is home to around 12,000 people, many of whom live here but commute to work in Belfast, just 5 miles away, and easily reached by road or by rail from Holywood's train station. With that in mind, Holywood has established itself through the past few decades as one of the most desirable places to live for people who work in Belfast. The town centre here, not just home to riveting history for visitors, but a variety of facilities that appeal to families and longer-term residents. the town home to a number of beautiful housing developments, like the ones we're passing here, along with schools, community centres, a yacht club, a golf club, and more, all of which helped Holywood to be ranked as the best place to live in Northern Ireland in 2021. It's an affluent and really rather pleasant town, with lovely surrounding scenery, and a bustling, characterful high street as we'll see in a few moments. But here just up the road from the Priory, we find an interesting sculpture named Johnny the Jig. Sculpted by the renowned artist Rosamund Praeger, this statue was made in memory of a local scout named Fergus Morton, who in 1952 was tragically killed in a car accident while out on a bobber job, the traditional week where scouts would go out on their own to do work for people in the local community. The Johnny the Jig statue today occupies a rather poignant position beside a playground at the end of Hollywood's High Street, and it's one of a number of examples of sculptor Rosamund Praeger's deep love for children. She also worked as an artist and illustrator for children's novels during her life. Praeger, born here in Holywood back in 1867, was a leading figure in Irish art, and a member of one of this town's most famous families, many members of which were buried in the Churchyard cemetery, which we visited at the start of our walk. Passing by Holywood's former post office in Grey there, we'll talk more about Rosamund Praeger in more detail when we pass by her former studio just off the High Street later on. But we're now coming up on the junction between the High Street and Church and Shaw Road, at the centre of which there stands one of the most famous structures not just in Holywood, but in all of Ireland. Standing tall in the middle of the junction, you'll find Holywood's iconic Maypole, a famous landmark of this town, and renowned as the last surviving maypole on the entire island of Ireland. Maypoles were once commonplace across Europe as the main structure in local folk festivals and May Day celebrations, and Holywood's Maypole was originally built around 300 years ago in the 18th century. According to legend, the pole was actually the mast of a Dutch ship, whose crew gifted it to the people of Holywood in return for their help after the vessel had run aground on the shore here. Just in the shadow of the town's Maypole, meanwhile, you'll find the Maypole Bar, which first became a licensed bar in 1857, and amazingly, from then until 2018, it only had 3 owners. In Holywood, the bar is locally known as Ned's, after its second proprietor, Ned Carty, and along with only having had a trio of owners over the course of more than 150 years, the Maypole Bar is also regarded as a truly traditional Ulster pub, built in part from the sandstone that many ships arriving into Belfast from Scotland used as a ballast while crossing the seas. Now, the soaring Maypole that we can see today may stand as an icon of Holywood's illustrious history, but despite what I've just said about the pole being around 300 years old, as of recently, that's not exactly true. Sadly, just last year in February of 2021, the original, possibly Dutch-built Maypole was destroyed in high winds, and so the High Street junction here, in the shadow of the town's modern parish church that we can see in the distance, went without its iconic Maypole for the first time in 3 centuries. Fortunately, just 7 months after the original was destroyed, this replacement was erected in autumn of the same year. And so while it may not be quite as old as its reputation suggests, Holywood's new Maypole remains a famous landmark, and one that preserves the stories of old that make this such a riveting place to explore. But having now taken in a view of what is perhaps Holywood's most famous landmark, we now find ourselves in the part of town that's often busiest with people in the modern day, the bustling heart of Holywood's popular High Street. Now, the High Street here is well known to shoppers all over northern County Down, not simply for its classic high street chain shops, but the variety of quirky, chic and independent shops that you'll find along it, home to everything from traditional butchers to boutique coffee shops and more. People from all over the region come to Holywood for its slightly offbeat shopping portfolio and its pleasant atmosphere, but among the shops on the High Street there are yet more historic buildings to be found. Set back from the main road here is a beautiful palatial pink church, the first Holywood non-subscribing Presbyterian church, built in 1849 and fronted by an obelisk in memory of former minister Reverend C.J. McAllister. Designed by the architect Charles Lanyon, also responsible for the iconic main building at Queen's University Belfast, the church was opened to house a separate congregation of Hollywood worshippers that had existed since 1704, separate to the main Presbyterian congregation who worshipped over by the old Priory church, as we spoke about earlier. Now, Presbyterian and Protestant worship in general is the predominant religion in this part of Northern Ireland, and the number of churchgoers here in Holywood grew dramatically in the mid-19th century. We know that prompted the move of the Church of Ireland congregation from the old priory to the modern parish church, while the first Presbyterian church too became overwhelmed by the growing numbers, prompting the opening of the building across the road from us here, the High Street Presbyterian Church, which opened in 1858 to take the pressure off the first Presbyterian church. But why exactly was it that the numbers of churchgoers and the rest of the population grew so significantly in 19th century Hollywood? Well, Hollywood grew initially on the back of the popularity of sea bathing and seaside resorts in the early 19th century, as members of Belfast's upper and growing merchant classes became attracted by the therapeutic benefits of the fresh sea air and water. Many came to Hollywood simply on short trips from nearby Belfast, but the wealthiest decided to build homes for themselves here by the sea, which you'll find just a couple of minutes' walk from where we are here at the end of this street. Initially then, Hollywood existed as a quiet and rather exclusive retreat for the richest members of Belfast's rapidly growing industrial sphere. But this town soon began to boom further upon the opening of its railway station down by the sea, which came in 1848 on the line between Belfast and Bangor along the southern shore of the Belfast Loch. This was the key development that allowed Hollywood's popularity to soar, becoming accessible to wider swathes of society who came to relax by the sea and to explore its quaint town centre. And it was during that same period in the late 19th century that one of Hollywood's most famous families began to gain a reputation, most notably through brother and sister Robert Lloyd and Rosamund Praeger. Robert Lloyd Praeger was a leading Irish botanist who gained international acclaim, while his sister Rosamund Praeger, as we've mentioned, became one of Ireland's most renowned sculptors, and for 40 years, from 1914 until her death in 1954, she worked out of a studio that existed just here on what is today Hibernia Street. Now today, Hibernia Street leads down the hill from the High Street towards the sea, and the main coastal road and railway line which bypass Hollywood's town centre. If you are visiting Hollywood, it's only a short walk from this point to the town's rocky and rather bracing seafront, which offers some lovely views across Belfast Loch. We won't quite have time to visit the sea for ourselves on this walk, but just here we find ourselves on the newly redeveloped Redburn Square, on which there stands Hollywood's historic War Memorial. Unveiled 100 years ago in 1922, the memorial stands in honour of the men of Hollywood who lost their lives fighting in the two World Wars and the Korean War, and it's famously topped by a soldier bearing arms while looking out towards Belfast Loch, considered by locals as if he's protecting the town of Hollywood from a seaborne attack. Historically, the War Memorial was positioned just a few feet away from here, closer to the railway station, but it was later moved as one of a number of changes to this part of the town in recent decades. With the railway station and the main road passing just by here, this is the point where many people arrive into Hollywood, and they're greeted by none other than the iconic Holywood Sign. Well, perhaps not as iconic as that other Hollywood sign. The Hollywood across the pond is of course much younger than this Hollywood, having only emerged as a suburban neighbourhood of Los Angeles around the 1880s, around the same time when this building, Hollywood's Orange Hall, was built. Dating to the late Victorian period, the Orange Hall sits at the bottom of Sullivan Place, which will lead us back up from the seaside here towards the High Street, along which we'll continue towards the southeastern edge of town, where you'll find the soaring St Colmcille's Church. But as we make our way back up the hill here towards the High Street, what else does Hollywood have to offer visitors and residents beyond the fashionable shops, captivating history, and many more wonderful characteristics we've spoken about so far? Well, as its lively shopping sphere, Hollywood is well known around Northern Ireland as the host of a number of festivals throughout the year, the most famous being its Blues and Jazz Festival, typically held over the bank holiday weekend at the end of May. That festival is usually held on the outskirts of Holywood in the neighbouring village of Coulter, where you'll also find another nationally famous attraction in the form of the Ulster Folk and Transport Museums, opened in 1967 and which display two polar opposites of the long history of Ulster. The two museums are among the most popular in Northern Ireland, and we'll talk more about them in a few moments. But as we come to the top of Sullivan Place here, we're returning to the High Street, which at this point is home to Holywood's Grand Town Hall. Built in 1873, the Town Hall is by far and away the largest building on the central portion of Holywood's High Street here, and it was constructed not just as a new meeting place for the local government, but also as a demonstration of Holywood's grandeur and prowess come the late 19th century, having emerged as one of the most popular and populous seaside towns on the shores of the Belfast Lough. As we know, the influx of wealthy merchants in the early 19th century saw Holywood's population began to grow dramatically. But it was actually in the 20th century that this town saw the greatest expansion in size, with its population roughly quadrupling from around 3,000 people in the year 1900 to the 12,000 people that live here today. Of course, Holywood's development has in no small part been linked with that of Belfast. In the 19th century, Belfast grew to become the largest city in all of Ireland on the back of its mighty linen trade, shipbuilding industry and more, but most of the workers who served in those industries lived in the city's sprawling suburbs. It's become more common for people to live in Holywood or other picturesque villages surrounding Belfast in the last couple of decades, however, with the end of the Troubles and the modernisation of Belfast's economy having brought in new levels of growth and development to this region of Ulster, in turn benefiting the development of ever more affluent towns just like Holywood here. And even if you don't live in Holywood, there's every reason to take a trip here, to explore the town's history as we've seen so far, to gaze out across the sea, or even to explore a pair of Northern Ireland's most popular museums. As we mentioned, the neighbouring village of Coulter is home to the Ulster Folk and Transport Museums, which draw in thousands of visitors from all over the UK and Ireland each year. The Transport Museum is notably home to the largest railway collection in all of Ireland, while the Folk Museum is hugely popular for its portrayal of the traditional customs of the Ulster people, and for a really rather cool 170-acre open-air museum that's complete with historic dwellings and buildings that recreate life in a rural Ulster community around 100 years ago. Interestingly, back here in Holywood town, if you stray off the High Street back near the old Priory where we began our walk, you'll also find an often missed piece of history that shows a slice of life from roughly 800 years ago. Known as the Holywood Motte, this is a man-made mound dating from the early 12th century, and which is thought to have been topped at one point by a Norman-era building, possibly what would have been considered as Holywood Castle. Little is known about Holywood Castle, if it even existed at all. Although what we do know is that in the year 1210, the English King John actually came to stay overnight at a residence here, possibly that which stood on top of the motte. However, as we pass by this fetching row of Victorian-era terraced townhouses, we're now coming towards the last landmark of our walk around Holywood for today, which also stands atop a raised area of ground at this opposite end of the High Street. Standing tall on the edge of the modern town, here we find the beautiful St Colmcille's Church, the town's Catholic parish church. Now, as we've explored on our walk along the High Street from the old Priory, Holywood is a predominantly Protestant town, with a range of Presbyterian places of worship alongside the Victorian parish church, but roughly a quarter of the town's population today also hails from a Catholic background. This church, then, serves the practicing members of Holywood's Catholic community, and services are today held inside the rather modern-looking circular church on our left here, opened not too long ago in 1995. However, the history of Catholic worship in Holywood goes back much further, to the mid-19th century in fact. Beside the modern St Colmcille's Church, there stands a soaring tower which dates back to 1874, when the original St Colmcille's was opened here on the edge of town. But after having served the local parish for 115 years, in 1989 the former church was almost entirely destroyed by a devastating fire, with only the spire and bell tower here surviving. Fortunately, the tower and spire were restored and retained on the site of the original church, and they today stand alongside the modern church as a striking reminder of what came before. And so, having started our walk just 20 minutes ago, looking at the remains of a former parish church, we've strolled along Hollywood's High Street and through the centuries to finish up by looking at the remains of another former parish church. However, as I hope you'll agree from this walk, there's so much more to Hollywood's riveting history that makes it a fantastic place to visit. From the affluent and lively community of today, to the captivating remains of its priory, the storied churches and buildings which line its main streets, and of course the iconic Maypole, even in its brand new form. So as we look up at St Colmcille's Church on this gorgeous day, that brings us to the end of our walk around Holywood for today. Thank you so much for watching this video. I really hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you're looking forward to visiting star-studded Holywood for yourself sometime soon.